I've heard of gods changing people's minds, but I'd never heard of a God changing someone's heart. Now, Nathan, I heard so much about you as a prophet and your friendship with King David. I want to thank you for taking the time to meet with me and listen to my story. I know Queen Abigail has already spoken with you about my time as her servant. And when I heard you were putting together a biography of King David's life, I was compelled to come and share with you the same story I've been sharing with my family and friends for the past 20 years. Now, I've done a lot of things in my 43 years here on earth, and right now I'm apprenticing to be a carpenter. It's a little late in life, but I've heard talk that there might be construction of a temple sometime soon. But back when I was younger, I was a shepherd. I worked for this guy, Nabal. He was a Calebite, and as such, he thought pretty highly of himself. I understand now that Nabal in Hebrew means fool. I find that hilarious. Had he known that everyone was calling him a fool straight to his face his entire life? And he was a fool, but rich. If I've learned anything in my life, it's that a rich man can do just about whatever he wants. And if he surrounds himself with enough yes men, no one will ever call him out. And landing a wife such as Abigail, beautiful and smart, a man like him could only have done that with his wealth. Now, I'd been Nabal's servant since I was just a boy, and I spent most of my time out with the sheep, tending the flocks, keeping the predators away. And being a shepherd, I'd heard a lot of stories about David. I mean, we all had. He isn't that much older than me, and I remember hearing a story of his battle with Goliath. I can't tell you how many stones I flung with my sling trying to be like him. I mean, I wasn't ever any good. And try as I might, I couldn't even hit an olive tree trunk. And the few times I did see a lion going after the sheep, the last thing I was going to do was provoke them and have them coming after me by throwing a stone at them. Now, don't get me wrong, I was a pretty decent shepherd, but I wasn't a warrior. So this one year, we'd had a pretty good year. In fact, we hadn't lost a single sheep to any of the bandits coming down from the hills or off the road. We usually lost quite a few to them, but this particular year, David was hiding out nearby. He'd been running from the king, Saul, who was trying to kill him. I never did quite figure out why King Saul wanted him dead. Jealousy, maybe? We'd all heard that song, Saul has killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands. I guess that could bother a man, but enough to want to kill him? But like I was saying, that year had been a good year, and we all knew why. David's men were up on the road beside us and behind us every day. I'm figuring they were on the lookout for King Saul's men, but all the same, they kept the bandits and the thieves away. They were like a wall surrounding us. And sometimes one of us would go up and talk with them, and they'd tell us stories about David, how one day he'd be king. But they didn't talk in a way that would suggest they were boastful about it. It was more matter of fact, like they had this simple confidence. There was this one guy I talked to whenever I could, Emina, which I believe means faithful. He was about my age. I think he must have been one of David's trusted men, because I seemed to run into him quite a bit. I remember him telling me about them all hiding in a cave and having King Saul so close to him that all David had to do was extend his sword and he would have killed him. And all their troubles would have been over. But he didn't. He actually cut a piece of his cape off to show that he could have killed him later, but he wanted to show that he had no ill will towards the king. I think this happened just before he and his men showed up near us in Carmel. I couldn't tell if Emina was upset or simply in awe of David not killing Saul when he had the chance. It makes me wonder, what kind of heart must David have had to refrain from taking Saul's life, from claiming the kingship that he deserved? So, the story I'm telling you here, Nathan, it took place on a feast day. I was trying to get some time in with my girlfriend at the time, a gal I had a crush on, Shayna. She was one of Abigail's maids. It wasn't anything serious. I certainly wasn't high enough on the totem pole to catch someone such as her, but we were sitting on this little hill away from the crowds. Down below I saw a dozen or so men about my age. They were coming up the road. I recognized the man in front as Emina. So I wandered on down to see what was going on. And I heard him step right up to Nabal and say, "Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing, all the time that they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they'll tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your sight, for we've come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." Hearing this, I moved closer to the group. They were all standing around in kind of a circle. Nabal, he stepped forward, his big belly drooping over his belt. His yes men gathered behind him. There was a long silence, and I tried shouting out to them, but then Nabal saw me. His eyes had daggers in them. And I just froze in my spot and said nothing. And Nabal, he raised his hands up in the air and billowed, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and the meat that I have butchered for my shears and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" In my heart, I wanted to cry out, "What are you doing, Nabal? These men have protected us all season long. How can you say you don't know who they are? Ask me, I'll tell you the good they've done for us and for you." But I didn't. I said nothing. And Nabal, he just stood there with this dumb grin on his fat face. He twirled around in a circle with his hands still up, standing in the center of the circle, and just stared at David's men. Nabal's yes men stood behind him with their arms crossed, and everyone was silent. Without a word, David's men, they turned their back to us and went back the way they'd come. All the yes men, they gathered around Nabal, slapped him on the back as they paraded back to the tent for more food and wine. But I circled around the back of the tent just to make sure I wasn't seen, and then ran for the road where David's men were walking. I went right up to Emula and asked him what was going to happen now. He told me it wasn't going to be good. I'd learned the prophet Samuel, the one who anointed David and spoke God's words that he would one day be king, even while King Saul was still on the throne. But Samuel had died recently. This and the fact that David was tired of running. He was ready to be king, but he knew he had to wait. But that waiting was wearing on his nerves. An insult such as Nabal's was going to push him over the edge. "I'm sorry," Emula said to me. "It won't be good." Then he and his men, they just kept on walking. So when I heard this, I ran back to Shanna and told her what had happened. She insisted I go and talk to Abigail. "She's clever," she told me. "She'll know what to do." So I did. I went straight to the house where Abigail was, and I told her flat out, "David sent messengers out of the wilderness to salute our master, and he shouted insults at them. Yet the men were very good to us. We suffered no harm. We never missed anything when we were in the fields, as long as we were with them. They were like a wall to us, both by day and by night. All the while we were keeping the sheep." I was shaking. I was so nervous. Abigail, she just stared at me. She was so beautiful, and I could see her mind moving. I had this lump in my throat when I said, "Now therefore, know this. and consider what you should do. For evil has been decided against our master and against all his house. He's so ill-natured that no one can speak to him." Now, I had an inkling about what she would do. I knew what I likely would have done were I in her shoes. I would have loaded up a few choice goods, gathered my girls together, maybe a few servants, and taken off. Here was a chance to get away, scot-free, from that oaf of a husband, Nabal. But she didn't do that. She looked for a moment far away and then said to me and all of us around, "Hurry up. Come with me." We all followed her. Myself, the maids, a few of my friends, and we headed down to the storehouses. All the while she's shouting orders. "Load up 200 loaves of bread. Get 2 skins of wine, 5 of those sheep that are already dressed. Get some parched grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 fig cakes. Get them loaded on the donkeys quickly." And she pulled me aside down there in the storehouse and said, "Go on ahead of me. I'm coming after you." The donkeys were all loaded pretty heavy, but the air was still relatively cool, being early in the spring. And we plodded along for what seemed like days. It couldn't have been more than a couple of hours. I felt like we were on our death march, our last effort to try and save all the household. I wasn't ready to die. We were all of us silent for the most part. We avoided eye contact with one another. It was a very, very somber trek. And I saw a large group approaching. There were hundreds of them. I could see the glint of their steel swords in the scabbards as they approached. I felt for certain we were all good as dead. David was a good man from the stories we'd all heard, but Nabal had gone too far. There was no reason in the world why he wouldn't have his men kill us all right then and there, and then take the women and the bounty. I heard later from Emula that David had just told his men, "Surely it was in vain that I protected all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. But he has returned me evil for good. God do so to David and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him." He was on a rampage, and we were the next to be counted towards his tens of thousands. And then Abigail, she showed up on a donkey coming down under the cover of the mountain, just as we were approaching David and his army. I saw Abigail jump from her donkey and rush up to David, who was leading his men. And me, I ran right up to the front of our pack just to make sure they didn't hurt her. And I said, well, I was no fighter. I wasn't just going to stand by if they did try and harm her. Abigail threw herself on the ground right at David's feet and said, "Upon me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. My Lord, do not take seriously this ill-natured fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, I did not see the young men of the Lord whom you sent. Had I not been shaking in my sandals, I would have laughed out loud to hear Abigail call her husband a fool in front of everyone. But no one laughed. And as she spoke these words, I didn't see any change in David's expression. There was still that look of vengeance. His hand still sat on his sword, right at the ready. And he looked at all of us one by one. It was almost as if he were sizing up who he was going to kill first. But Abigail went on. She was close enough to David to touch his feet. Now then, my Lord, as Yahweh lives and as you yourself live, since Yahweh has restrained you from blood guilt and from taking vengeance with your own hand, now let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be like Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for Yahweh will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of Yahweh, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. This is as I heard it, Nathan. I've replayed her words in my mind over all these years. She used the name of Yahweh, your own God, as she spoke to David. As I said, we'd heard about David letting King Saul go and that Yahweh had restrained him from that blood guilt act, but I was amazed nonetheless at the way in which Abigail spoke to him. She went on, "When Yahweh has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pains of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for having saved himself. And when Yahweh has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant." I watched David as she spoke. His eyes, they started to soften. His hand slipped off of his sword and fell to his side. And all the men that were with him, they all seemed to respond the same. I felt the presence of God or Yahweh, something. It was as if this calm had suddenly rushed down from the mountains. David, he stood silent. Then he looked up at the sky and he replied, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Israel, who sent you to me today." Now, I'll be honest, at the time I wasn't really sure who this God of Israel was, and I wasn't sure how David attributed our coming down to try and pacify him from killing us, all of us, to this God. I thought this was our one last effort to save us all from being slaughtered, but it was all before I heard, or I don't know if I understood or understand, but that your God changes hearts. David's heart, it was changed at that moment. I could see it on his face. It almost became radiant. "Blessed be your good sense," he continued, "and blessed be you, who have kept me today from blood guilt and from avenging myself by my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried to come to meet me, truly by morning there would not have been left in Nabal so much as one male." Abigail, still laying on the ground, looked up at David, and he took her by the hand. He said, "Go up to your house in peace. See, I have heeded your voice and granted your petition." And when we got back to the house in the ball, he was already drunk with his yes men. They were having a grand old time. I got a glass of wine myself just to calm my nerves. That the day had worn me out. But Abigail seemed unfazed. She wandered around, visiting with her maids. I saw her at one point approach Nabal, and he let out a big yell and slapped her on the backside, and then went back to drinking with his buddies. Shayna told me the next day that she had overheard Abigail telling Nabal about everything that happened the day before. About how his insolence and evil towards David had put everyone at the risk of death. And then that in fact she'd headed David off at the pass on his way to kill everyone. I'm not certain what went through Nabal's mind when he heard this, but I wonder if he didn't finally realize that his actions, what he did and what he said, actually warranted death. I'm not sure Nabal ever could have admitted that he was in need of someone to save him from himself. But in fact, David had done just that. They say Nabal never spoke another word after Abigail talked with him. That he froze as if he had had a stroke, and then he died 10 days later. It was sometime after that I saw some of David's men coming up to the house from the road. Abigail, she'd been much happier after Nabal had died, that oppressive weight being lifted from her. I ran up to the house to greet David's men, and there with the entourage was Emila. Abigail came out from the house and was standing there, and they said to her, "David has sent us to you to take you to him as his wife." And Abigail bowed down before them. "Your servant is a slave to wash the feet of the servants of my lord," she said. I saw Shanna. She ran and got Abigail's things and helped her up onto a donkey, and they were gone. And I stayed behind, and I've shared this story with anyone who would listen. And thank you for listening to my story, Nathan. I hope that you'll talk with Queen Abigail and Shana and Nemula to verify that all that I've told you is true. This story, it's my hope that this story of David's heart being changed by your God, by Yahweh, might be able to be told for generations. But before I leave, can you explain to me what happened to David that day, Nathan? I've been telling this story for so many years, and I still don't understand why he spared us. We were nothing but a bunch of servants working for a fool of a man. I wept as I handed over that donkey I'd been leading to his men. I fell on the ground and I wept. But what happened in those few hours from when David was set on killing us? Those few moments when Abigail pleaded with him for mercy. I've been mad before too. I've been insulted. And I've sought vengeance on those who wronged me or said bad things about me. That's what we do as men. We protect our name, our dignity. We stand up for ourselves. And on that day, all of us deserve to die. Myself included, because I served an evil master. But David spared us. And then he said it was Yahweh who had done all of this. He said Yahweh had restrained him from hurting us. What can change a man's heart like that, Nathan? Will you tell me more about him so that I can be his servant too?